Anyway, there is actually something else that I wanted to talk about, and that is the Kanye West Joe Rogan podcast. That was super interesting. The second I saw that pop into my feed, I'm like, this is going to be 3 very interesting hours. I'm wondering who else has seen it, because Kanye is running for president, and he had a lot to say. And I think people ain't going to take him seriously. And after listening to the podcast, I don't know if I would take him seriously if I were in America. I don't know who I would vote for if I were American. Geez, like, being more of a left-leaning person, I would probably end up voting for Biden, but I mean, it just always feels like the lesser of 2 evils when you vote. Same over here. Looking at chat, a lot of people not keen on Kanye, which, all right, fair enough. I like, when I listen to a podcast, I like to take my preconceived notion of what I think of someone and then let it be evaporated. Okay, like Miley Cyrus was on there recently, and because she was a pop star, and I remember, like, what was it? Yeah, Miley Cyrus. Oh, wait, what's her real name and what's the character name? She had like another name when she was younger, when she was working with Disney. Anyway, like, I immediately become aware that I have a sort of Hannah Montana. There you go. Thank you. I'm like, I have a like preconceived notion of who you are, because when Hannah Montana was a thing, I was like like an elitist metalhead listening to black metal and hip hop and like, oh, pop music's awful and all that kind of thing, right? I had that attitude. So I kind of had like a hangover perception, and I'm like, I know what happens when I listen to the podcast. You hear people, and all those ideas tend to fly out your head. And so I listened to the Miley Cyrus one, and I just loved it. It was just great to hear her tell her stories, and you're like, yep, you're just a human, and all that stuff about rah, 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 pop music, product, Disney, it's just nonsense. And it was just cool to listen to her stories and like listen to them talk about whatever they talked about. Same thing with Kanye. It's like, okay, so I got this like conception of Kanye through listening to his music, through how the media portray him, how he portrays himself. And then like, I'm going to listen to this podcast and this stuff's probably going to get like shattered. But it didn't really. It was very interesting because the way in which Kanye talks about his various ideas and the things that he wants to do and does, he uses a very kind of almost poetic way of speaking, but it's kind of not. It's like when you refer to things without actually going through the details of it. So it's kind of like, it's actually, poetic's probably a terrible way to describe it. It's like inarticulate in a way. So he would start saying, oh, like when he gets asked a question or whatever, or when he's doing on one of his long tangents, he'd start to talk about like, oh, if you look at this and you do your research on that, and if you know about this, and make references to like a bunch of different things. And it just ends up sounding like a bit of nonsense if you're not initially thinking the same thing he is, right? So when we communicate, if we can be really specific and clear about stuff, then we have a far better chance of communicating ideas. If you don't do that like he wasn't, you kind of leave things open for interpretation. So when he starts talking about stuff I have no idea what he's on about, then he starts to sound a bit, kind of like all over the place. But then when he talks about ideas and concepts that I'm actually quite familiar with, then I'm like, oh, right, I get what you're talking about. But it's this concept of information siloing, that when we communicate with one another, we've all been exposed to like a whole different world of information. And when we talk over ideas and say, I'm for this or I'm not for that, we kind of forget that we've all been exposed to different information about this stuff, and we don't have always the best means to see what it is other people know about. So like when he talks about stuff that I don't really get what he's getting at, it would be good to know, where did you learn this from? Like, what things have you been watching? What have you been listening to? What books have you been reading? Like, then I could perhaps understand these points better. So yeah, because of that, I found the opening part of the discussion to be like pretty kind of like, oh, this is crazy. I don't know what to think of this. But as it got further and further into it, I started to realize that he talks a lot about things he's doing that I have no clue what he's up to. Like, again, it's the whole preconceived notion of people and realizing that everyone's lives are just so much more bigger and complex than you can really just know about from a distance. And so he's involved clearly in like tons of companies and doing all these things with clothing companies, and then doing a lot of stuff with trying to set up monasteries and homeless shelters and feeding people. There's all these projects that he's getting involved with, and it all sounds so fascinating, but I really know very little about it. So, being human, we like to have opinions, and I'm just going to like expose my ignorance to it a little bit. But anyway, getting towards like the end of the conversation, I started to realize something, which is, as Joe was pointing out, like he doesn't talk like a politician. And one of these things that I've always held on to from kind of like a young age, being exposed to politics, alternative ideas to capitalism and whatnot, is that the candidates that come through the politics system, they always just seem like, like they're cut for the job. They're part of the system. You don't really have that much of a choice when you vote, right? You're sort of voting for essentially either side of the same coin, right? Could be a way to phrase it. You're not voting for massive systemic change or for a big shift in the way society is run. You're voting for this kind of like marginal shift of power. And what you think you always want is someone who talks different, right? Someone who isn't like that, someone who isn't part of that process and that system. And so you could look at Kanye and think, well, he's definitely not that, right? Clearly not that. But, there you go. Like, you think you always want someone outside of the system, but this is what it looks like when you get people who run outside of the system. Trump's from outside of the political system. So's Kanye. It's just a really weird thing. It's, like, in a way, by the end of listening to that podcast, I realized he sort of, in a way, kind of represents more of what I thought I'd want to hear from someone running for president. Like, he talks a lot about like letting love and compassion for other humans be like a guiding force in making decisions, which on one hand sounds fantastic, and on the other is like almost like non-specific as well. Like, it's a non-specific way. Like, it's all great to hear that someone wants to be compassionate and do things for the good of people, until maybe you find out that, oh, your idea of compassionate is very different from mine. Not saying that's the case with him, just that's what it's kind of like, right? Oh my God, no, the US learned what it's like to, when unexperienced people are elected, would you hire an unexperienced person as a manager or a CEO? Why do it for a politician? This happy hooker. Well, because politicians have it has a negative connotation for a lot of people. We see a political system as one of like this very Machiavellian about, maneuvering for power. And I'm not saying that's what it is. I'm saying it has there are people like myself that can look at politics and see it like that. It's very hard to tell. There are figures in politics that seem to be part of that world, the shaking hands behind closed doors, kind of people pulling the strings of what happens in our world, right? So to have someone from outside that to go in and control the power could be a good thing. It's like, imagine you're running a company like you described there, and you want to hire someone, right, who's not qualified to do what you do. Sounds like a bad thing. But if the nature of the job is that you perceive it to be damaging or corrupt or not going in the right direction, bringing in someone from the outside with a different perspective could be exactly what it needs, right? So that's what I'm kind of getting at here. And again, like, I'm not trying to frame things like this is right, this is how it is. I'm just saying this is how some people tend to view these things. I tend to view politics with a bit of a raised eyebrow. Like, I get that, people have to do these jobs and control and run the world and organize governments and societies, but at the same time, a lot of it does have this fishy kind of corrupt feel. just in the way that candidates get picked and selected and who they're supposed to represent. Gerrymandering would be a good example, right? You know, you have politicians using their power to keep themselves in power through gerrymandering. And that don't seem right. You know, that's why we can have a negative view of this stuff, essentially. But yeah, we were talking about Kanye and his appearance on Joe Rogan. I thought it was good. And you know what? He brought up something I thought was really fantastic, and I'm glad he said it. But he talked about like how people say he's going to split the black vote. And then he pointed out like that's kind of deeply racist in a way, because it's as if all black people have to like vote together and stick together. And then I think about like, well, where does that ever arise in conversation? And I imagine it will reveal some truths where some people talk about it, that it's pretty obvious that there are deep systemic problems in society for individuals of color. You know, it kind of remind me that you'd hear that said by people that would deny that those things exist. And it's interesting that they would say that, because if you think it through, he's totally right. It's a really terrible thing to say in a way. There were a few other things that popped up in that live stream as well, but that's the one that really like sticks in my mind as being like quite fascinating. Gamer Xisuma says, let's not talk politics. Here on my channel, you know, I'm going to talk about what I want to talk about. I don't talk about politics to get into the debate, the us versus them. I'm not interested in that. I'm here to just talk perspectives and keep it in the middle and keep it, you know, fair for anyone who's got an opinion on stuff, right? We got a noise in the ear here from Bleep with a donation saying, I'm really happy to see how open-minded you are, especially in this current climate where a lot of people are clouded by hate and blame. You're like a breath of fresh air. Thank you. Sorry for getting a bit mushy. No problem at all, dude. Get all mushy as you want to. Thank you so much for the donation. Appreciate it. Yeah, I am a very kind of like middle of the road, trying to look at like how everyone is thinking and feeling and perceiving, and I've come to that place purely through like, you know, and where I started out would have been on the left, right? Like, you know, all those typical lefty sort of values, that would be where I kind of started out, and then along the way I was like, well, I want to hear what people on the other side have to say and like understand their point of view. And in doing so, I realized that just we're all people, and the most common thing that we tend to have is like compassion and the ability to care for one another and want to do good things. Yet these ideas seem to divide us, and we get too caught up in them and too separated from one another. And I think there should just be more communication across the board, and not being sucked into this idea that if someone thinks and feels a different way about how things should be done or run, that you got to get up in arms and upset, you know, because that's just going to push us apart from one another, whereas we need to talk and understand. And the other big thing is like, I also just realized that when I started listening to people from, you know, the right hand side, if you like, I was like they're educated different, like they've been exposed to different information, and that's a big deal that we can just be exposed to completely different information. It's like a game of chance, right? Like, let's say we set up two dictionaries with two libraries with two different ideologies, and people go in and, you know, you pick one or the other, and it's the only library you're ever allowed to go into. You know, you're going to spend many years of your life wrapped up in a certain form of information, and then when do you come out of it, what are the chances that the people who went into either library are going to hold and adopt some of those values, right? We're massively influenced by the things around us, and they're not evenly distributed. And so literally by, you know, where you're born or what ideas you're first exposed to could kind of shape who you end up being or what your ideologies are and political beliefs. It's kind of crazy if you think about it. Like, we like to think that we're not biased or we're level-headed, but that's kind of not what reality's like. Like, there's so much bias, confirmation bias. Have you ever searched something looking for the answer that you want to hear, and then being like, oh, there it is, you know? And that's a big deal. I catch myself doing it now, like every now and then. I'm like, oh, I like this because I agree with you. You know, I'm listening to a podcast and this person has the same opinion. And I'm like, yeah, tell them. And then I'm like, oh, no, wait a minute. This is just confirming my bias. This isn't research. This isn't figuring something out mathematically or statistically or, you know, getting to a pure sense of truth. This is just someone's opinion backing up mine. And that's a really common thing. And just look out for it. Just observe it, you know, and then see what you think of it when it occurs. Because there's been like tests and, you know, what do you call it? Sociological tests, right? Like they expose people to the same message over and over again, and then it becomes believable. We will be more likely to believing something on the basis of hearing it a lot, right? Like if we are on Hermitcraft just to go around saying, oh God, look at Impulse's skin. I feel like I'm not going to come up with a good example, but like Impulse is upside down, like Dinnerbone now. Keep saying it over and over again. Then someone will believe it, and then they'll see Impulse is the normal way up, and then you'll be like, what? No, I thought Impulse was upside down. I'm sure of it. Terrible example, really, but repetition bias is how advertising works, says Burt Potato. That is true, and that is my better example because I have experienced it. You get advertised to. I go to a store, I want to pick a bottle of water. What one do I pick? Now, the presentation plays a role. The one that looks nicer or appeals to the person I'm more likely to buy. But brand recognition is huge. I can't remember when it happened, but it was like something that happened a few years back. And this is like, as I'm exploring these ideas and learning about these concepts. And I talked about it on stream. I was like, you know, I went to buy something and I ended up just buying the one that I felt most comfortable with. But why did I feel comfortable with it? Because it was brand recognition, because it had been advertised to me. I like to feel that I'm immune to it, and I know it's all capitalism. They're just trying to sell me stuff, but it gets in there. It works. I totally brought that thing because it was the one that I recognized, and that made me feel comfortable. And that is the psychology of it right there.